Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallis is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. This week's episode is an essay I wrote a couple of years ago called The Real Story on Kuṇḍalinī. The word Kuṇḍalinī has become what linguists call a free-floating signifier. That is, it is used to mean virtually anything people want it to mean. In that context, the question, what really is Kuṇḍalinī, is impossible to answer. Even dictionaries don't agree. For example, 2 English dictionaries chosen at random don't share a single word in their respective definitions of Kuṇḍalinī. One has latent female energy believed to lie coiled at the base of the spine, and another has the vital force lying dormant within one until activated by the practice of yoga, which leads one toward spiritual power and eventual salvation. The concept which these 2 definitions implicitly share is that of some kind of potential energy that is dormant or latent in most people. Interestingly, that very concept is not found in any of the Sanskrit texts in which the first documented instances of the word Kuṇḍalinī appear. Let's back up to the beginning and explore this seemingly impenetrable subject in some depth. Firstly, it's important to mention that Kuṇḍalinī is a Sanskrit word that first appeared in Tantric texts about 1,300 years ago, and which didn't appear in any other kind of literature for several centuries afterward. So if we want to understand Kuṇḍalinī, we must look to the Tantric tradition that originated both the word and the teachings that surrounded it. We immediately run into a problem here. There hasn't been any major scholarly study of this topic. This is likely because the Sanskrit scholars who've looked into it and are qualified to write about it have realized that the topic is enormous, challenging to master, and difficult to write about in a variety of ways. One of the challenges is that the word Kuṇḍalinī has undergone a number of semantic shifts, meaning it has changed its meaning over time and in different contexts. To parse all the ways in which this key term was used in the various stages of the Tantric traditions would be an enormous and difficult study. There's actually only one book on Kuṇḍalinī written by a Sanskrit scholar that I'm aware of, a book originally written in French by Lillian Silburn in 1983. Silburn was, unfortunately, not a great Sanskritist, and though her book cites some very important primary sources, she simply didn't understand those sources as well as one might have wished. Her book fascinates, but also obfuscates. But it was still a valiant attempt, and there's been no further attempt in the scholarly world in the 40 years since. And there cannot be an authoritative book on Kuṇḍalinī not written by a Sanskritist, because the vast majority of sources on the topic have never been translated. Many of them still exist only in manuscript form. In the absence of authoritative work on the topic, there's a huge amount of speculation. In modern spiritual culture, Kuṇḍalinī is a buzzword that is pressed into service by different people to serve their particular spiritual and sometimes even financial agendas. Before I delve into some of the primary sources, I need to say something that is unfortunately controversial, but is nonetheless true. What is being taught in countless yoga studios right now under the name of Kundalini Yoga is a form of practice that bears no relation to any traditional practice associated with the word Kundalini. The modern practice that goes by the name Kundalini Yoga was created by a man called Harbhajan Singh Puri, better known as the 3HO cult leader, Yogi Bhajan. If you regard this kind of Kundalini Yoga as an authentic traditional practice handed down through generations, I invite you to look at a brilliant article by the scholar Philip Deslippe called From Maharaj to Mahan Tantric, The Construction of Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga. This scholarly article proves that Yogi Bhajan didn't inherit, but rather fabricated the practices that he transmitted to his students under the name Kundalini Yoga. And why does this matter? Well, it doesn't necessarily matter if somebody loves that practice and it benefits them. I think it's important to know, however, that the practice taught as Kundalini Yoga in Western yoga studios today, whenever it derives from Yogi Bhajan, which it nearly always does, has no relation to what is taught in connection with the word Kundalini in the original Sanskrit sources. Having cleared that hurdle, we may ask, what is Kundalini in the original Tantric sources, and how does it relate to yogic practices? When it comes to the issue of what Kundalini really is, it seems that everyone who believes themselves to have had a Kundalini awakening and written a book about it claims to understand the topic better than anyone else. Here I'm simply engaged in a historical inquiry, since the topic of the spontaneous psychophysical event referred to in our time as Kundalini awakening is well beyond my purview, though it both merits and demands proper scientific study. And please note that this spontaneous life-changing psychophysical event was not called Kundalini awakening in the pre-modern tradition. It was usually called Shakti, which I've covered in detail in my PhD dissertation. When people ask what Kundalini is, they're asking the wrong question, at least vis-a-vis the traditional teachings, in the same way that it's the wrong question to ask what chakras are. These are not ontological entities just sitting there existing, waiting for you to notice them. They are elements of practice, so they are processes, not things. In absence of the process of engagement we call yoga sadhana, it's simply meaningless to ask what they are. Even if you define Kundalini as an energy, as most people do today, it's important to remember that energy never exists as a thing in itself, but only as a property of an active system that accomplishes something observable. In other words, the concept energy only has meaning as part of a process. In this case, the process of spiritual awakening that produces observable transformations in the subjective experience, psychology, and even physiology of the one who undergoes it. As a historian, I'm interested in what we can actually demonstrate to be true through evidence-based research. Unfortunately, almost all our evidence for the pre-modern period is textual, and these Sanskrit texts are entirely prescriptive, not descriptive. This means that they don't describe people's real-life experiences. They tell you how to do specific practices. We don't have data on how well these practices worked or how many people awakened as a result. But we do know that the Tantric tradition became so influential and widespread that teachings and practices that weren't effective or highly regarded probably didn't survive for very long, because the tradition had a reputation to uphold and royal patronage to maintain. Now let's look at a few of our earliest primary sources. The earliest documented usage of the word Kundalinī is in the Nishwasa Karika, which means something like the stanzas exhaled by God. And it's a text that dates to around 600 CE. There, Kundalinī is identified with the goddess and is said to be the ultimate source and substance of this universe, para prakriti, and is furthermore the generative matrix of the Sanskrit language, matrika. We see almost the same articulation in a slightly later source, the first known text of the Kaulatrika lineage, which is called Siddha Yogeshwari Mata, which means the doctrine of the perfected goddesses of yoga, or perhaps the doctrine of the Siddhas and Yoginis. In this fascinating, as yet unpublished text, we find this verse. Yasa Kundalinī Satra Jagadyoni Prakirtita Shakti Traya Samudbhutis Tato Varna Samudbhavaha. This means that Kundalinī is proclaimed to be the Jagadyoni, the womb of the universe, or the source of the world. In the second line, it is stated that Kundalinī is the source of the three primary Shaktis, meaning the three goddesses of the Trika and or the three powers of willing, knowing, and acting. And, furthermore, is the source of all the sounds of the Sanskrit language, and or the source of language more generally. So, in our earliest sources, the term has a much bigger scope than most people realize. It is a name for the goddess herself, the generative matrix of both the universe and of language, especially the language of mantras. From the beginning, Kundalinī is a linguistic and mantric power. But she is more than that as well, as we will see. We see a different usage of the term in a text from the same time period, the Kalottara, or Transcendence of Time, which is a Shaiva Siddhanta scripture. In the Sardha Trishati, or 350-verse recension of the Kalottara, also datable to about 700 CE, we find a single mention of our key term, and this time Kundalinī is localized to a specific region of the body. Please note, it is not the base of the spine, nor the base of the torso, nor is she said to be dormant. Here's the quote. The primordial coiled one is fused with the sun, Pingala channel, moon, Ida channel, and fire, the Sushumna, or central channel. She is to be visualized and experienced in the region of the heart, where these three channels converge, remaining there with the appearance of a curled sprout, unquote. And there's another related text that specifies this is a sprout of flame. We see Kundalinī frequently characterized in early sources as being coiled, crooked, or curled. When she straightens out in the central channel, she becomes a salvific, liberating power. All three of these early texts have little to say about Kundalinī, but it seems significant that the term appears around the same time in both of the two main streams of the classical tradition, which were in many ways opposite. On the one hand, the non-dualistic, transgressive, goddess-worshipping stream, sometimes called the left current or Kaula tradition, and the dualistic, Veda-congruent, Shiva-worshipping stream, sometimes called the right current or Siddhantika tradition. In other words, Kundalini was, in origin, an exclusively Tantric doctrine that originated in the texts and traditions of both main branches of Shaiva Tantra. And again, it would be centuries before the term appeared in any other kind of literature. Let's look at one more early verse. The following Kaula verse has an unknown origin, but it occurs in a number of different texts, such as the Kulananda and the Matsyendra Samhita. Though its source is mysterious, we know it's more than 1,000 years old because Kshemaraja quotes it. The verse is as follows: Urdhva Shakti Nipatacha Adha Shakti Nikunchanat Rudra Shakti Samavesham Yojanati Sapanditaha. One who experiences the type of immersion into divine power that occurs due to the descent of the upper energy and the contraction or compression of the lower power is a truly wise one. Unquote. In classical Tantra, there is a doctrine of two Kundalinis, cited, for example, by Kshemaraja, as well as seen in the verse just quoted. An upper Kundalini in the crown of the head, which is to be brought down towards the heart, and a lower Kundalini in the base of the body, often associated with sexual energy, which is to be compressed and encouraged to rise up. The two Kundalinis, it seems, are supposed to meet and merge in the central channel, and thereby become one Kundalini, causing the stabilization of awakened awareness. This is a fundamental concept in some forms of classical Tantra. We see it, for example, in the Recognition Sutras, chapter 18, and it suggests that the normal human condition is an unintegrated one. The primary integration, then, is to unite the upper Kundalini with the lower Kundalini. In later Hatha Yoga, however, this doctrine was lost. And so Hatha Yoga gave us the popular current understanding of a dormant power at the base of the body, or base of the spine, that needs to be impelled upward until it reaches the crown of the head, which is the end of its journey. This is markedly different from anything we find in classical tantric sources. Furthermore, from the non-dual tantric perspective, this Hatha Yoga view is out of balance and even dangerous in a certain sense, because it encourages a relentless upward movement which is inherently transcendentalist and therefore anti-embodiment. This, despite Hatha Yoga's emphasis on physical practices, we see that tradition's conviction that the body is inherently impure in its obsession with extreme cleansing practices, for example. The urge towards transcendence needs to be balanced in classical tantric yoga by the movement down into embodiment. You don't relinquish the transcendental impulse, but you learn how to unite and integrate it with the impulse to say yes to embodied existence. That's the key. Tantric authorities would not have been surprised to learn that modern practitioners who push their Kundalini energy relentlessly upward often have psychotic breaks. Thankfully, most of them recover from those breaks. In the Kaula verse cited above, there are two causes of divine immersion specified. Each is necessary, but not sufficient without the other. The verse says that the upper Kundalini needs to descend, and the lower Kundalini is to be contracted or compressed, which effectively pumps it upward. The verse suggests that if you can create the conditions that facilitate the descent of the upper Kundalini and perform the practices that create the compression of the lower Kundalini, then you'll experience what's called Rudra Shakti Samavesha. This means experiential immersion into the most intense power of awakened consciousness, a topic covered in detail in my doctoral dissertation. In this context, Rudra Shakti literally means divine power. It's also a specialized term where Rudra refers to something fierce or intense. When Rudra Shakti Samavesha is experienced, you are utterly bathed and immersed in intensified divine energy due to the fusion of the two Kundalinis. You become a truly wise person, according to the verse, but this is not intellectual wisdom. It is insight into the true nature of reality. This is discussed in some detail in Chapter 18 of my book, The Recognition Sutras, where Lord Kshemaraja presents 10 key practices for how to access and expand the center, the core of one's being, and thereby experience the natural and innate bliss of awareness. In that teaching, the upper Kundalini is to be stimulated through uchara practice and invited to flow downward once it is activated. The lower Kundalini is stimulated through a specific sexual practice in that text, which Kshemaraja draws from the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, verse 68. But according to other sources, it can also be stimulated through non-sexual practices, practices that work with the special sacred center called the Khanda, the so-called secret center between Swadhisthana and Manipura chakras, the same location called the lower Dantian in Taoism, halfway between the navel and the genitals. Kshemaraja also uses a mysterious phrase in this section of Chapter 18 when he talks about nourishing the lower Kundalini and straightening it out. Now, what does that mean? This is where we come to the very important fact that the very word Kundalini literally means the coiled one, with feminine grammatical gender implicitly agreeing with the word Shakti, power. So it's a coiled power. So what is this coiling and straightening out actually referring to? It seems that the earliest form of Kundalini Yoga focused on the breath pause, primarily the pause at the end of the inhale. Most people don't take the time to pause between breaths, but if you pause long enough, the energy of prana Shakti coils up in anticipation of the next breath cycle. So the breath comes in and down to the belly, and then if you hold the prana Shakti there, it coils at or around the navel. And there are a number of manuscript images depicting exactly this, though it can also coil at the level of the heart, according to some of our sources. So if you pause for longer than is normally comfortable, the coiling intensifies in anticipation of the exhale. At this point, you can fuse the energy of the breath with a single-syllable mantra called a bija, or seed syllable. The subsequent exhale is the coil straightening itself out, as it were. You want the energy of the bija-infused prana to ride the exhale upward, but the key is to induce it to enter the central channel, which is perfectly straight, as opposed to its usual path in the curved side channels. And this involves the application of Mula Bandha. Now, towards the beginning, I said we needed to understand Kundalini as a process, or part of a process, not an entity or a thing in itself. And this is exactly what I meant. It is only when we fuse the power of the retained breath with a bija mantra, and then that energy enters the central channel, that we could call it Kundalini. In the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, another early source, circa 800 or 850 CE, we can see the mystery we've been discussing here in plain sight, but it has not been recognized by most translators of the text. One needs to compare verse 24 to verse 154 of the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, because these two verses are complementary. Verse 154 brings the text full circle. The relationship between these two verses, the first and last practice verses of the text, is crucial to understanding the revelation of the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. Verse 154 states, "The exhale moves forth, and the inhale enters, forming into a coil of energy by the power of the will. The prana extends and lengthens up the central channel. That is the great goddess, both higher and lower, the ultimate place of pilgrimage." Possibly the phrase higher and lower here is an early reference to the doctrine of two Kundalinis. This teaching was still so secret at that time that often the word itself wasn't even used. Here in the verse we see the word kutila, coil, instead, a common synonym in the literature. We also encounter it in the earliest Nishwasa texts. To summarize the main point here, when the power of the breath energy is held in kumbhaka, breath pause in the heart or lower down in the belly, and then fused with a mantric syllable, then it becomes Kundalini as it enters the central channel. And the significance of the coil is that it indicates there's a kind of dynamic tension, like a spring has, that wants to release upwards. And the longer you hold the kumbhaka, the more it wants to release upwards. And if it releases up the central channel, carrying that bija mantra with it, then it can pierce through any barriers, blocks, or obstacles on the way, inducing a very powerful opening, perhaps even an awakening. And as we have seen, there's also an upper Kundalini which needs to descend. These two movements towards transcendence and towards embodiment in the world need to be integrated with each other for full liberation in the Tantric view. Now, originally, in classical Tantric yoga, Kundalini was never described as dormant, nor did it have anything to do with a snake or serpent per se. So where did this association come from? Well, in some early sources, we find the simile of prasupta nagabha, meaning that Kundalini has a form like a sleeping serpent. How does a serpent sleep? Coiled up, in a spiral in its hole. So as a coiled energy, Kundalini is like a sleeping serpent, but this doesn't imply that it is asleep or dormant. That idea or misunderstanding came later. In the early sources of classical Tantra, we don't see any specific association of Kundalini with snakes, except in terms of this specific simile. It's just as often associated with a sprout or a tongue of flame. Remember, Kundalini simply means the coiled one in the feminine grammatical gender. It does not mean, as many websites and even dictionaries claim, a coiled snake. Now, as I've mentioned, there are also specific Kundalini Bija mantras, and the coil concept is relevant here as well, because these mantras, if you write them in the script of that time, sometimes include a kind of coiled shape. So what were the Kundalini Bijas originally? Well, I'm not certain because they're never explicitly stated. Was there just one or more than one? I'm not sure, but I think one of the Kundalini Bijas was very likely Hrim, and another was probably Hraum, and another was almost certainly Hum. All three of these mantras begin with H, or the H sound, and when you write them in the script of that time, that sound has a coiled shape. So to say that Kundalini is like a sleeping serpent could have been a coded reference to these mantras beginning with H. The most secret mantras were always given in code so that someone picking up a text wouldn't be able to ascertain the mantra just from reading the text. A living teacher was necessary, and the tradition tried to sustain that principle. Finally, according to the Netra Tantra, also from around 800 CE, when the Kundalini Bija is resonated correctly and with sufficient intensity, it becomes what's called a nada suchi, a sound needle, which has the ability to pierce the so-called psychic knot in the center of the head, or just below the center of the head, called the Rudra Granthi, or the Maya Granthi. This psychic knot is what prevents you from experiencing the true unity of reality in this yogic theory. The mantra intensely vibrated there as the sound needle pierces the knot little by little each time until there is a big opening. Then you have access to the upper Kundalini energy, which is eternally dwelling at the crown of the head, and it can flow down and merge with the lower Kundalini until you have one Kundalini Shakti moving in the central channel. What's the consequence of that? Well, you experience an aliveness so vibrant, so vivid, so complete, that your life before seems to you to have been something like sleepwalking. When the two Kundalinis unite and move in the central channel, you experience this absolute full aliveness, consciousness, and presence, compared to which what you thought was aliveness was just stumbling around in a half-conscious daze. I'll conclude by noting that much more research on the topic is needed. For example, the great master Abhinavagupta taught, on the basis of a now lost scripture called the Trishiro Bhairava, that there are actually 3 Kundalinis. Prana Kundalini at the base, Shakti Kundalini at the heart, and Para Kundalini at the crown. Many people who have experienced what they call Kundalini awakening have experienced only the first of these 3. Abhinavagupta's teaching, as usual, weaves together and makes sense of all the extant sources available at his time. Interestingly, Abhinava's teaching of the 3 Kundalinis seems to have inspired a revised version of the Kaula verse cited above, which appears in the later Amarauga Shasana attributed to Goraksha in this form. Urdhva Shakti Nipatacha Tatada Shakti Kunchanat Madhya Shakti Prabodhena Jayate Param Sukham. Due to the descent of the upper power, the contraction of the lower power, and the awakening of the central power, the supreme joy arises. And that is clearly the same Kaula verse of unknown origin cited previously, modified to include a third central Kuṇḍalinī. And we see a very similar verse in a much later text, the Siddha Siddhanta Padati, composed probably around 1700, so just a few hundred years ago. And that text says, by means of the awakening of the central goddess power, as a result of the compression of the lower goddess power, and by means of the descent of the upper goddess power, the supreme level of liberation is attained. She is only one, but by being classified as central, upper, and lower, she has 3 names. She who is always inherently able to hold the individual self in the middle of her light is celebrated as the central goddess Kuṇḍalinī. And the text goes on to describe all 3 forms of Kuṇḍalinī, and you can read it in Jim Mallinson's translation in his wonderful book, Roots of Yoga, page 216 to 18. And finally, Swami Lakshmanju's 20th century Sanskrit text, the Kuṇḍalinī Vijñāna Rahasya, also teaches 3 forms of Kuṇḍalinī on the basis of Abhinavagupta's Tantraloka. So, if there's sufficient interest, that might be the subject of a future episode. We have quite a lot of research still ahead of us to tie all of these ancient threads together into a truly cohesive picture of the original Kuṇḍalinī yoga. But many of the pieces of the puzzle are right here, finally presented to the public. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in Tantric philosophy, Tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.